There is a highway that once ran from a beach on the Atlantic to a beach on the Pacific, 2,726 miles in a straight administrative line across 8 states, and today more than 60% of it has been erased by vote. It's called U.S. Route 80. When it was designated in 1926, it was one of only 2 federal highways in the country built to run ocean to ocean. At one point in the 1950s, more cars entered California on it than on Route 66. Today, most of its western half doesn't carry that number on a single sign. This was not simply abandoned, not left in the desert to crumble on its own schedule, not quietly bypassed and forgotten like 1,000 other roads. It was removed on purpose by committee vote 4 separate times over 27 years. The United States has thousands of miles of old highway alignment lying around. Almost all of it just sits there, because leaving pavement in place costs nothing and striking a designation costs paperwork. This is the highway that lost that argument again and again until there was barely 1,000 miles of it left. 2 things worth holding on to for later. In 1965, a federal judge decided exactly how many people were legally allowed to walk this road to Montgomery, and the number he picked came directly from the pavement, not from politics. That's coming, and it's the strangest piece of legal reasoning in this whole story. And for years, part of this highway crossed a river by driving straight over the top of a dam. The dam is gone now. The bridge that replaced it is still standing. I'll get to that too. This is the story of U.S. Route 80, the Dixie Overland Highway, the Broadway of America, and how a road built to never be snowbound ended up mostly gone, not because it failed, but because the reason for it did. Follow it from the Georgia coast to a fence in the California desert, and I'll show you what's actually still out there. To understand why anyone built a highway across 4 states of desert and swamp, you have to understand the problem the promoters were solving. It wasn't distance. It was winter. Every other transcontinental route of the era crossed the Rockies or the Sierra Nevada, and every one of them shut down for months at a time. The Automobile Club of Savannah looked at a map in 1914 and picked the one line across the country that would never be snowbound. That was the entire pitch, an all-year road in the one climate belt where snow wasn't the enemy. But a road that avoids the mountains has to fight everything else instead. East of the Mississippi, and for most of the way west of it, every existing road ran north to south because that's how the cotton trade moved, and that's how the rivers ran. There was no east-west grain to follow. The promoters had to cut straight across it, and they made a virtue of the problem. They crossed each river at the head of navigation, the furthest point inland a boat could reach, which is also the narrowest, shallowest place to put a bridge. Then came the Colorado River at Yuma, squeezed by granite outcrops into one of the only crossable gaps on its lower course. Before 1915, the only way over was a ferry, and the ferryman refused to work past 6 in the evening. Travelers who arrived at dusk slept in their cars, watching the lights of Yuma across water they couldn't cross. West of that, the Algodones Dunes. 45 miles of shifting sand, the largest dune field in the Sonoran Desert, sitting directly between the river and the Imperial Valley. One engineer who surveyed them in 1920 admitted he approached the whole thing with something which approached a fright. And behind San Diego, a mountain range that drops 4,000 feet in a handful of miles with no gentle way down. There was no federal money to build any of this. That's the fact that explains everything else in the first act. Road promoters in the 1910s assumed Congress would eventually fund national highways directly. It never did. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 sent money to state highway agencies instead, on a rough 50-50 match, and that single funding structure explains why this highway got built county by county, subscription by subscription, wherever the local money showed up first. San Diego citizens raised $60,000 privately just to push the road from the county line down to the desert floor. A developer named Ed Fletcher personally raised $13,000 in San Diego and another $3,000 in Yuma to buy 37 carloads of lumber for a road across the dunes. Because there was no machine for the problem, the answer was timber. 2 tracks of 2x12 plank, nailed to cross ties, 25 inches wide each, laid straight across the sand. It needed constant maintenance, so the state kept a crew stationed at a well on the edge of the dunes purely to dig it back out after every windstorm. The cars of the era dictated the grades too. A Model T fed fuel to its carburetor by gravity. On a steep enough climb, the fuel simply stopped arriving. Drivers reversed up hills to keep gas flowing downhill into the tank. On one documented 1910 trip up the grade toward Jacumba, a passenger rode out on the front fender, pouring gasoline directly into the carburetor by hand while the car moved. The road wasn't primitive because the engineers were careless. It was exactly as good as 1915 could make it. Construction on the Plank Road began on February 13, 1915 and took about 3 weeks. Total cost, roughly $20,000, privately raised. A year later, the state replaced it with an 8-foot wide version, turnouts every 4/10 of a mile so 2 cars could pass. Sections were rebuilt in redwood in 1924. In August 1926, the planks were finally replaced by 6.5 miles of asphalt concrete on raised sand fills, built to the height of a 30-foot dune, then oiled to keep it from blowing away, because engineers had worked out that small dunes move fast and large ones barely move at all. Cost, $340,000, split evenly between state and federal government. At Yuma, the Colorado River Bridge had its own construction problem. It was designed by government engineers in Washington who had never seen the site. Twice that winter, the river washed out their false work. The contractor gave up building over the water and built the steel truss on the bank instead, then floated it out on barges and swung it into position on March 3, 1915. It opened 7 weeks later with a parade, a concert, and horse races. Downstream in Arizona, the Gillespie Dam Bridge went up between January 1926 and August 1927. 9 steel spans, 1,662 feet, for $320,000. And in Mississippi, the Vicksburg Bridge across the Mississippi River opened in April 1930. A combination road and rail cantilever truss with the highway deck built inside the same truss work as the tracks. Here's the detail that tells you what it was actually like to drive this road in its first decade. The maintenance man on the Plank Road was a 6'2" teamster named Bill McGee. He never wore a hat. 7 years driving a horse team, clearing sand off the planks and towing cars back onto the track when they slipped off. No known relatives. Killed in a car accident near the dunes in April 1928. In 1919, the Automobile Club of Southern California put a front-page warning in an El Centro newspaper telling motorists to avoid the Plank Road entirely. Cars were being wrecked, engines racked and shattered, and because almost nobody else was on the road, a breakdown could leave you stranded long enough to die of thirst before help reached you from Holtville or Yuma. Up near the top of the mountain grade, a speculator named Bert Vaughn built a 4-story hotel, a bathhouse, and a stone lookout called the Desert View Tower, specifically because that was the spot where climbing cars overheated and stopped. Build where the cars have to stop and the hotel doesn't need to advertise. It's still standing. When the state replaced the Plank Road with asphalt in 1926, officials planned to hand the old timber to the local irrigation district. A newspaper editorial argued to preserve it instead, so they left it where it lay. For decades afterward, people just walked out and took pieces home for firewood. Real quick, if you're getting something out of this, the best thing you can do is watch it through or hit subscribe. That's it. Back to the road. San Diego had no direct rail line east. Los Angeles did. Roads were San Diego's only path to transcontinental relevance, and the western half of this highway exists exactly where it does, because San Diego out-organized and outbid Los Angeles for the terminus, first at a convention vote in Shreveport in August 1918, confirmed by committee the following spring. At the dedication of the Mountain Springs Road in 1913, the chairman of the Imperial County Board of Supervisors told the crowd that Valley Produce would now move to San Diego for market, and the city's coffers will in a few years teem with the Valley wealth. The highway broke a monopoly twice. At Yuma, the bridge ended the ferry in 1915. At Vicksburg, the 1930 bridge ended a ferry crossing and became, for a period, the only bridge over the Mississippi south of Memphis, not New Orleans, not Baton Rouge. Its success is what triggered the planning of those cities' own crossings the following decade. By the late 1920s, $23 million in federal aid money had gone into 1,500 miles of the route, with the federal government covering just under half. What it produced was simple, a year-round transcontinental option. In 1927, the Bureau of Public Roads told motorists this was the one combination of routes that stayed open every month of the year, while warning accurately that the desert stretches got uncomfortably hot in summer. This is where the dam comes in. Around 1920, a rancher named Frank Gillespie financed a concrete diversion dam across the Gila River in Arizona. At the time, the largest privately financed irrigation dam in the state. It was the fourth structure built at that spot. The previous three, made of earth, stone, and wood, had all washed out. Because the dam sat exactly where the highway needed to cross the river, the state poured a concrete apron at its base so cars could drive straight across the spillway. When water was running high, trucks towed cars through the current. When the river flooded, the crossing simply closed. In anticipation of the new federal highway system, the state built a proper bridge just downstream instead. 9 steel truss spans, 1,662 feet end to end, opened in August 1927 with concrete piers sunk into bedrock. On the morning of January 9, 1993, after a winter of record rainfall, about 120 feet of the dam collapsed into the river. It was one of the largest dam failures in Arizona's history, and it was never repaired. The bridge lost a little pier settlement. That's it. The dam it was built to bypass is gone. The bridge that was supposed to be the backup plan is the thing still standing. Both of them are out there today on Old Highway 80 near Arlington, an intact steel bridge and a gap in a dam in the same frame. Start with sand, because sand is not what people assume it is. The problem was never that it was soft. The problem was that it moved. Every track cut across the Algodones filled back in almost as fast as it was cut. On the plank road, the failure was mechanical and repeatable. A rear wheel slipped off the 25-inch track, the car settled into loose sand, and it stayed there until a horse team came to pull it out. One engineer described the finished road as humped up on one side and dropped down upon the other, writhing like a snake when the sand shifted. The 1926 fix wasn't to stop the sand from moving. It was to build higher than it, raise the roadbed to the height of a 30-foot dune, and steer around anything bigger, since the big dunes barely move at all. Then there was the grade. A gravity-fed carburetor starves on a sustained climb. On the Mountain Springs grade, that wasn't an inconvenience. A car could be mechanically incapable of the ascent facing forward. Then there was water in a canyon, which is the one that actually killed people. The original wagon road ran down the bed of Devil's Canyon, a slot between rock walls dropping 1,000 feet in 3 miles. One account from the period is blunt about what happened if a cloudburst hit while you were in it. A car could be picked up by rushing water and battered to pieces against the walls. The 1913 replacement moved the road onto the mountain's flank specifically to get away from that. And it kept happening after the interstate took over. In September 1976, Tropical Storm Kathleen dropped over 10 inches of rain on the mountains above the desert in a single night. A wall of water came down out of a canyon onto the town of Ocotillo, built directly on its path, and destroyed most of it. A quarter mile of Interstate 8 and a 60-foot bridge were torn out of the ground. At one crossing, 600 feet of freeway became a gully 35 feet deep. The old highway roadbed above it was wrecked in the same storm and never rebuilt. The replacement road failed the exact same way the original did. Water in a canyon, moving faster than anyone built for. The documented cost of this road runs from a fatal car accident all the way to a fatal ambush, and the worst of it happened in Alabama in the spring of 1965. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young deacon, was shot by a state trooper during a night march in Marion on February 28th and died from the wound. His death is what prompted the decision to march from Selma to Montgomery down this highway. On March 7th, Bloody Sunday, roughly 600 marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge into a line of state troopers standing 3 deep across all 4 lanes. 50 marchers were injured. 17 were hospitalized. Reverend James Reeb, beaten in Selma afterward, died on March 11th. On the night of March 25th, after the march reached Montgomery, a 39-year-old mother of 5 named Viola Liuzzo was shot and killed on this highway in Lowndes County while driving a 19-year-old volunteer back toward Selma. One of the 4 Klansmen in the car that chased her was an FBI informant. The first trial of the man alleged to be the shooter ended in a hung jury after the defense argued in open court that she had brought it on herself. A stone marker went up at the site in 1991. It has been vandalized more than once, including a Confederate flag painted across its face in 1997. Elsewhere on the corridor, the cost was slower. The company that built the Vicksburg Bridge went bankrupt. The county bought it back in 1947 with revenue bonds. And in Lowndes County that same year of 1965, white landowners evicted black tenant farmers by the dozens for registering to vote. This is where the number comes from. On March 17, 1965, federal judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. ruled that the march to Montgomery could go forward with police protection on one condition. For the 22 miles where this highway narrowed to 2 lanes through Lowndes County, no more than 300 people could walk it at once. Not for safety in the abstract. Not as a political compromise. Because for 22 miles, the road itself was 2 lanes wide, and that was the number a 2-lane shoulder could hold. The moment marchers crossed into Montgomery County, where the highway widened back to 4 lanes, the cap disappeared and the crowd grew to 8,000, then 25,000 by the time King spoke from the Capitol steps. The road that carried that march is the same road that decommissioned itself, piece by piece, starting almost exactly then. In 1964, California passed a law requiring every state highway to carry one number, with priority given to interstates first. Because Interstate 8 was going in on the same ground, California asked the National Highway Committee to strike its section of Route 80 from the official log. Arizona followed in 1977, removing the road to Benson. New Mexico and the rest of Arizona followed in 1989. And in 1991, Texas and New Mexico asked to strike the last stretch, from the New Mexico line to Dallas, in a press release titled, "What's in a Name?" The stated reason: the road shared its route with 3 interstates, and 2 names for the same pavement cost money in duplicate signage. That's the whole reason. No hearing on record, no organized opposition. A road that carried a voting rights march was erased mile by mile to save money on signs. 4 interstates were assigned in 1957 specifically to replace this highway. Interstate 8 from San Diego to Yuma, Interstate 10 from Tucson to Pecos, Interstate 20 from Pecos to Meridian, and Interstate 16 from Macon to Savannah. What made that possible wasn't better engineering. It was a change in who paid. Under the 1916 law that built this highway, the federal government covered roughly half and states found the rest, which is exactly why the road got built county by county out of Chamber of Commerce fundraising. Under the 1956 interstate program, the federal share jumped to 90%. A state that had spent 40 years begging for matching funds could suddenly build a divided 4-lane freeway on a straighter line for 10 cents on the dollar. And because the new roads had that kind of money, they didn't need the old alignment at all. Interstate 10 and Interstate 8 cut straight through towns like Casa Grande and Wilcox, skipping the long indirect route through Florence, Tombstone, and Bisbee that 1920s money had required. That's the reason so much of the old highway is still sitting there intact in Arizona today. The interstate simply never needed its right-of-way. Locally, it played out over 2 decades. California phased the highway out between 1964 and 1974 as Interstate 8 was completed. Louisiana opened its interstate in stages between 1960 and 1977. The new Vicksburg Bridge opened in February 1973, and the old one lost its road traffic to it 7 years later. In Jacumba, the interstate went in 2 miles north of town, and the roadside businesses folded within a few years. The hotel, 4 stories, 65 rooms, once host to Clark Gable and Marlene Dietrich, closed and burned in an arson fire in 1983. The ruins stood for 8 years before anyone tore them down. The baths closed. The pool was filled in. The well was capped. In Yuma, the old river bridge lost its highway traffic in 1956, then sat closed to vehicles entirely from 1988 to 2001 before being restored. In Vicksburg, the bridge kept carrying local traffic for 25 years after the interstate bridge opened, until concrete failure closed it to cars for good in 1998. It still carries freight trains. In Tucson, over 280 historic motels and roadside structures survive along the old alignment because the interstate went around the city instead of through it. And across West Texas, a whole chain of small towns got bypassed on a schedule. Lorain in 1957, Merkel and Roscoe in 1959, Abilene in 1961, Colorado City in 1963. Each one losing its highway traffic on its own separate, dated afternoon. One more aside, since we're already in Jacumba. The town sits at 2,800 feet on the last high ground before the mountains drop into the desert, next to a hot spring that runs about 104 degrees. Bert Vaughn built the hotel in the tower purely to make drivers stop, and for 3 decades it worked. By the 1930s, on a good weekend, locals say 5,000 people pass through. In 1951, with its founder aging out, the entire town went up for sale as a single lot. 300 acres, 101 buildings, the water company, the pool, all the furnishings included. Asking price, $400,000. Then the interstate opened 2 miles away, and none of it mattered anymore. The 2020 census counted 540 residents. Here's what's actually still out there. In San Diego County, most of the old highway between El Cajon and Jacumba survives on its original 1920s and 30s concrete, narrow, cracked into slabs, weeds growing in the joints, often barely 2 lanes wide with no shoulder at all. It's signed with brown historic Route 80 markers. 5 stretches are missing entirely, including the climb through Incopa Gorge, where most of the old pavement was destroyed in the 1976 flood and never rebuilt. What's left is mostly visible only from the interstate running below it. The Plank Road itself is a California historical landmark, and what remains is fenced off, mostly buried under sand. To see it, you exit the interstate at Grayswell Road, drive 3 miles on a frontage road with the interstate audible the entire way, and arrive at a fence. From that fence, you can see the interstate that replaced it. In Arizona, long stretches of the old highway are completely intact, simply because the interstate took a shorter line through different towns. The old river bridge at Yuma carries traffic again. The Gillespie Dam Bridge is open on a paved county road with the breached dam visible from the deck. In Mississippi, the old Vicksburg Bridge carries freight trains in one service lane, closed to cars, open occasionally for foot races and bike rides. In Alabama, the highway is still active, still called US 80, and simultaneously a national historic trail, a national scenic byway, and a road people drive to work. The Luzzo marker stands at the exact milepost where she died. And near Whitehall, on ground that used to be Tent City, where families evicted for registering to vote spent 2 winters in canvas tents while men fired rifles into the camp at night, there is now a National Park Service visitor center with a replica of the tents standing where the real ones stood. The interstates that replace this highway are genuinely better roads, straighter, wider, divided, safer than a 2-lane bridge with 9-foot lanes and a gravity-fed grade. The 1991 reasoning that duplicate signage on shared routes wastes money isn't wrong. It's correct. What nobody counted was the bypass economy. There's no federal line item for a hotel that existed because that's where cars overheated. When the reason a business existed disappears 2 miles down the road, the business doesn't relocate. It closes quietly, one town at a time, and it never adds up to a single event anyone has to answer for. And there's a harder fact underneath all of it. The road that carried the 1965 march was, at the time, still popularly called the Jefferson Davis Highway. Alabama still legally recognizes that name today. This corridor was never preserved once. It has been repeatedly, contentiously redecided which pass gets kept and which sign goes up. 2,726 miles, 4 committee votes, and 1 highway now cut down to just over 1,000. None of this happened because the road was badly built. It was built about as well as 1915 knew how to build anything, on the only line that Decade's equipment could hold. What killed it wasn't a flaw in the pavement. It was a change in who was paying for the next one. That's the thing about an old highway alignment. The road doesn't fail. The reason for it fails, and the road just stays exactly where it was poured. Route 66 lost its own designation in 1985 and became the most famous road on Earth anyway. Route 20, drawn on the same 1926 map, got extended instead of erased, and is now the longest road in the country. This is the one that lost the argument 4 times and mostly disappeared for it. If you live along Interstate 8, Interstate 10, or Interstate 20, go look at the frontage road next to you. In a lot of places, that cracked strip of concrete is US 80, still lying where it was poured 100 years ago. Tell me what mile marker you're near and what's still standing.